You see, there is a moment in every relationship with a narcissistic personality when something shifts quietly beneath the surface. It doesn't happen with a dramatic announcement. It doesn't happen with a loud confrontation. In fact, most of the time it happens in silence. And the narcissist feels it before you even say a word. Because for a long time, the dynamic between you and them has revolved around control. Not always obvious control, not always loud or aggressive. Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes it shows up as guilt. Sometimes it appears as charm or promises or emotional pressure. But beneath it all, there has always been an invisible thread pulling your attention, your energy, your reactions back toward them. And that thread is what keeps the narcissistic dynamic alive. You see, what many people misunderstand is that narcissistic control isn't only about dominating someone directly. It's about managing the emotional atmosphere around them. If they can influence how you feel, if they can shape how you react, if they can keep you explaining yourself, defending yourself, proving your loyalty, or seeking their approval, then the system stays intact. So for months, sometimes years, the cycle continues. They provoke a reaction. You respond emotionally. They twist the narrative. You try to clarify. They accuse. You defend. And without realizing it, you remain locked in their psychological orbit. But then something begins to change inside you. It might start with exhaustion. You begin to notice how every conversation circles back to blame. Every disagreement becomes your fault. Every boundary you try to set somehow gets turned against you. And slowly you begin to see the pattern that once confused you. You stop expecting understanding. You stop trying to win arguments that were never meant to be fair. You stop believing that if you just explain things clearly enough, calmly enough, lovingly enough, they will finally see you. And when that realization settles in, something powerful begins to happen. Your nervous system starts to disengage from the fight. You become quieter, not because you're weak, not because you've given up on yourself, but because you've stopped participating in the performance. Now here's the interesting part. Narcissistic personalities are extremely sensitive to shifts in emotional energy. They may not understand empathy in the way healthy relationships require, but they are deeply attuned to the flow of attention and control. And when that flow begins to dry up, they feel it immediately. At first, they sense something subtle. Maybe you're no longer arguing as intensely. Maybe you're not reacting to their criticisms the way you used to. Maybe the long emotional explanations they once triggered from you have suddenly stopped. You answer briefly. You stay calm. You don't chase them for reassurance. And to an outsider, it may look like nothing significant is happening. But for the narcissist, this is the beginning of a profound threat, because their sense of control has always depended on your emotional engagement. If you stop reacting, they lose their leverage. Think of it like a game that suddenly no longer has players. The narcissist has been operating with a set of psychological moves: provocation, guilt, blame, charm, manipulation. But those moves only work when someone is still invested in responding. The moment you begin stepping back emotionally, the board changes. And this is the moment they start paying very close attention to you. They may test the waters first. A small criticism here, a passive-aggressive comment there, a subtle jab meant to provoke the familiar reaction they've grown accustomed to. But this time something is different. You don't bite, you listen, you stay composed, you disengage. And the narcissist feels something they rarely allow themselves to feel: uncertainty. You see, people who rely heavily on narcissistic defenses build an internal identity around superiority and control. Admitting vulnerability, admitting insecurity, admitting the possibility of losing someone's emotional attachment, those experiences threaten the fragile structure of their self-image. So when they sense you pulling away, their mind begins racing. Why aren't they reacting? Why don't they seem upset anymore? Why aren't they trying to fix this? And that confusion creates anxiety, because what they're beginning to realize, often unconsciously, is that their influence over you is weakening. For a long time, they believed the dynamic was permanent. They believed your patience, your empathy, your willingness to keep working on the relationship would always keep you within reach. But now they see something unfamiliar in your eyes, distance, not coldness, not hatred, just clarity. And clarity is very dangerous for someone who depends on confusion to maintain power. When you finally see the pattern, you stop negotiating with it. You stop trying to heal something that refuses to acknowledge its own harm. And most importantly, you stop offering the emotional reactions that once kept the cycle alive. At this stage, the narcissist doesn't fully understand what's happening yet, but they feel the ground shifting. The emotional supply that once flowed so freely from you, the explanations, the arguments, the emotional investment, is quietly disappearing. And with it, their sense of control begins to slip. Now this doesn't mean they will calmly accept the change. Quite the opposite, because when someone who relies on control begins to lose it, their first instinct is not reflection. Their first instinct is escalation, but before the escalation comes this quiet moment of realization. The moment they look at you and sense that something inside you has changed, that you're no longer trying to convince them, no longer trying to be understood, no longer trying to win their approval, you're simply stepping away. And in that moment, they begin to understand something they hoped would never happen. You are no longer under their control. And once a narcissist senses that truth, everything that follows becomes their attempt to pull you back into the game. Because the moment they realize you're truly done is the moment the mask begins to crack. Now, once that shift begins to happen inside you, something very interesting unfolds in the dynamic between you and the narcissistic personality. Because up until this point, your emotional responses have been part of the system that kept the relationship running. Not because you intended it to be that way, but because human beings are wired for connection. When someone challenges us, misunderstands us, or hurts us, our natural instinct is to respond. We want to explain ourselves. We want to be seen accurately. We want fairness. We want resolution. And so for a long time, your reactions, your frustration, your sadness, your attempts to talk things through have been completely natural expressions of a nervous system that is trying to restore balance, but to the narcissistic personality, those reactions serve a very different function. They serve as confirmation. Confirmation that they still have access to your emotional world. Confirmation that they can still move you, provoke you, pull you into the dance. Whether the reaction is positive or negative doesn't actually matter very much. What matters is that the emotional connection remains active. Because attention, especially emotional attention, is the oxygen of narcissistic dynamics. If they criticize you and you become upset, that tells them something. It tells them they still matter enough to disturb your peace. If they accuse you and you passionately defend yourself, that tells them something too. It tells them you're still invested in being understood by them. Even if you're angry, even if you're hurt, the emotional thread is still intact. And as long as that thread exists, the narcissistic system continues to function. But something remarkable happens when you begin stepping out of that pattern. Instead of reacting immediately, you pause. Instead of defending every accusation, you allow the words to pass without chasing them. Instead of entering the familiar argument that once consumed hours or days, you remain calm, sometimes even silent. Now, silence in healthy relationships can sometimes be confusing or painful if it becomes avoidance. But in this particular context, something very different is happening. Your silence is not about shutting down communication. It is about withdrawing from a manipulative dynamic that has repeatedly distorted communication. You're no longer participating in the emotional trap. And this is where the narcissist begins to feel something they rarely tolerate well: the loss of emotional control. Because silence removes the feedback they depend on. When they criticize and you don't react, they can't measure the effect. When they provoke and you remain steady, their usual strategy stops producing results. The emotional mirror they once relied on becomes strangely blank. For someone who depends heavily on emotional reactions to regulate their sense of power, that blankness is deeply unsettling. It creates a kind of psychological vacuum. Imagine speaking into a room where every word used to echo back loudly, and suddenly the room absorbs the sound completely. No reflection, no amplification, no response, just quiet. That quiet forces them to confront something unfamiliar, uncertainty. They begin asking themselves questions they don't like asking. Why isn't this working anymore? Why aren't they upset? Why aren't they trying to fix this? Why aren't they explaining themselves like before? And because narcissistic defenses are built to protect against feelings of vulnerability or inadequacy, that uncertainty quickly becomes threatening. You see, many narcissistic personalities learned very early in life that vulnerability was unsafe. Perhaps their emotional needs were ignored. Perhaps they were shamed for expressing pain. Perhaps they discovered that projecting strength, control, or superiority was the only way to protect themselves from deeper wounds. So over time, they developed a strategy: stay in control of the emotional field. If they can provoke others, dominate conversations, or manipulate narratives, they avoid having to face their own fragile inner world. But your silence interrupts that strategy. Your silence removes the arena where their control once operated. And when the arena disappears, the narcissist experiences something close to panic, not always consciously, but deeply within their nervous system. Because the person they relied on to provide emotional reactions has stopped playing the role. Now, many people misunderstand silence in this stage. They believe it's about punishment or revenge. But genuine emotional detachment is neither of those things. It's about self-preservation. It's the moment your nervous system finally recognizes that constant engagement with manipulation is exhausting, destabilizing, and harmful. So instead of continuing to fight inside the same psychological maze, you step outside of it. You respond when necessary. You communicate when it's constructive, but you refuse to participate in the endless cycle of provocation and reaction. And the narcissist senses that difference immediately. They might try new provocations, stronger accusations, sharper insults, or sometimes the opposite: sudden kindness, unexpected warmth, moments of affection designed to see whether they can still reach you emotionally. But underneath all those attempts is the same underlying question: are you still emotionally available to be pulled back into the dynamic? And when your silence remains steady, not cold, not cruel, just calm and grounded, it sends a message more powerful than any argument you could make. It tells them their influence over your emotional state is fading. Now, for someone who relies on control to maintain their identity, that realization is deeply destabilizing. Because if they can't provoke you, if they can't move you, if they can't pull you into the familiar reactions they've depended on for so long, then the entire structure of the relationship begins to collapse. And that is why silence terrifies them. Not because silence is aggressive, but because silence signals something far more final. It signals that the emotional door they once walked through freely is slowly closing. And when that door begins to close, the narcissist understands something they hoped would never become true. You're no longer reacting, you're no longer chasing, you're no longer feeding the dynamic that once gave them power. You're reclaiming your emotional center, and when your peace becomes stronger than their provocations, the entire game begins to fall apart. Once the narcissist begins to feel that their usual tactics are no longer producing the same reactions, something inside them shifts from confusion to urgency. Up until this point, they may have believed your distance was temporary. Perhaps you were just tired. Perhaps you needed space. Perhaps in their mind, you would soon return to the familiar pattern of explaining, defending, and emotionally engaging the way you always had. But when your calm detachment continues, when the silence remains steady, and your emotional energy no longer rises to meet their provocations, they start to recognize a deeper possibility. You may actually be leaving the dynamic, and that realization creates something close to psychological alarm. Because for a narcissistic personality, losing someone who has long provided emotional attention, validation, or conflict is not simply the loss of a relationship. It feels like the loss of control over a part of their environment, and when that control begins slipping away, their instinct is rarely to sit quietly with the discomfort and reflect. Their instinct is to act. This is where we often see what I like to call the sudden shift into dramatic re-engagement. The person who may have spent months dismissing your feelings, minimizing your concerns, or blaming you for every conflict, suddenly becomes intensely focused on you again. The same individual who once seemed emotionally unavailable may now appear desperate to talk. Messages arrive more frequently. Conversations that once ended in indifference suddenly become urgent. And sometimes, the narcissist presents a version of themselves that seems surprisingly vulnerable. They may apologize, they may say things you've waited years to hear, they might acknowledge mistakes they previously denied. They might promise change, real change this time. They may even speak about their fears of losing you, about how much you mean to them, about how they finally understand the pain you've been expressing all along. And if you're someone with empathy, and many people who become entangled in narcissistic dynamics are deeply empathetic, this moment can be incredibly confusing. Because part of you wants to believe it, part of you has always wanted to see this side of them, the side that takes responsibility, the side that recognizes your experience, the side that appears open, reflective, and willing to grow. And in fairness, human beings are complex. People can change under certain conditions. Growth is possible when someone truly confronts their behavior with humility and sustained effort. But here's the important question. What is motivating this sudden transformation? Is it genuine self-awareness? Or is it fear of losing access to you? You see, one of the defining characteristics of narcissistic dynamics is that insight rarely appears when the relationship is stable, when things are functioning in their favor, when they still have emotional influence, when you're still reacting, when the cycle of control continues. There is little internal pressure for them to reflect deeply on their behavior. But when you begin to leave, suddenly reflection appears. Suddenly empathy seems possible. Suddenly they understand everything you've been saying for years. And that timing is not accidental. It is often a desperate attempt to reopen the emotional door that has begun to close. Now, this attempt doesn't always look manipulative on the surface. In fact, it can appear sincere. The narcissist may even believe parts of what they are saying in that moment. The fear of losing you can temporarily soften their defenses, allowing glimpses of vulnerability to surface. But without deep internal work, without consistent accountability, without the willingness to tolerate shame and discomfort over time, those glimpses rarely translate into lasting transformation. Instead, they function as a strategy to restore the previous dynamic. Think of it like a system trying to pull a drifting planet back into orbit. The emotional promises, the apologies, the declarations of love, they create a gravitational pull designed to draw you back toward the center of the relationship. And if you step back into that orbit too quickly, something familiar tends to happen. The pattern resumes. The apologies fade, the understanding disappears. The same behaviors that once caused so much pain slowly return, because the underlying structure of the relationship has not changed. Now, none of this means that you should automatically assume every apology is false or every emotional expression is manipulation. But it does mean that healthy change reveals itself through consistency, not urgency, real growth unfolds slowly. It involves sustained accountability, genuine curiosity about the other person's experience, and the ability to tolerate uncomfortable truths without immediately shifting into blame or defensiveness. Narcissistic desperation, on the other hand, often arrives with intensity and speed. The promises come quickly. The declarations are dramatic. The emotional urgency is overwhelming. And that urgency is meant to trigger something inside you. Your compassion, your hope, your desire to believe the relationship can finally become what you always wanted it to be. This is why this stage can be one of the most difficult moments for someone who is beginning to detach. Because now the narcissist appears to be offering exactly what you've been asking for all along: understanding, accountability, connection. But the deeper question becomes this: are they responding to your pain or reacting to the possibility of losing control? When you step back and observe calmly, the answer often becomes clearer over time, not through words, but through patterns. Because genuine change does not disappear the moment the crisis passes. If someone truly understands the harm they've caused, that understanding continues even when you're no longer threatening to leave. It becomes part of how they show up consistently, not just when they feel something slipping away. And so in this moment, when the narcissist makes that desperate attempt to pull you back in, your clarity becomes incredibly important. You don't need to argue, you don't need to attack them. You simply watch what unfolds over time. Because when someone is fighting to regain control, their words will rush forward long before their behavior truly changes. And the truth eventually reveals itself not in what they promise, but in what they consistently live. When you learn to recognize that difference, their desperate attempts to pull you back lose their power. And the emotional door they are trying so hard to reopen quietly remains closed. Now, when those desperate attempts to pull you back in don't work, something else begins to happen. And this is where many people finally see a side of the narcissistic personality that had been hidden behind the charm for a long time. Because up until now, the relationship may have moved through phases that felt confusing but still hopeful. There were moments of warmth, moments of connection, moments when you thought perhaps things were improving. Even during conflict, there may have been flashes of kindness that kept you emotionally invested. But when the narcissist realizes that the usual strategies, apologies, promises, emotional appeals, are no longer bringing you back into the orbit of the relationship, their internal tension begins to rise, and when that tension can no longer be managed through charm or persuasion, the mask begins to slip. Suddenly the tone changes. The same person who was recently pleading with you to stay may now begin speaking with anger, accusation, or cold contempt. Conversations that once carried a sense of vulnerability become sharp, defensive, even hostile. You might hear things like, "You're overreacting. You've always been the problem. After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me." And if you listen closely, what you're hearing is not reflection. What you're hearing is a defense mechanism trying to protect itself. You see, when a narcissistic personality feels the threat of rejection or loss, it activates something very powerful inside them, what psychologists often describe as narcissistic injury. This injury isn't just ordinary disappointment. It strikes directly at the fragile sense of self they've worked so hard to maintain. Because beneath the outward confidence, beneath the superiority, beneath the certainty that they project into the world, there often lies a deep fear of being exposed as inadequate, unlovable, or powerless. And when you begin walking away calmly, without rage, without begging, without needing their validation, it quietly confronts that fear. It tells them something they cannot easily accept, that their control over you is gone. Now a healthy person, when faced with the loss of a relationship, may feel sadness, regret, grief, even reflection. They might ask themselves difficult questions. What did I contribute to this? What could I have done differently? What can I learn from this experience? But someone operating through strong narcissistic defenses struggles to tolerate that kind of self-examination. The emotional discomfort is simply too threatening. So instead of looking inward, the mind searches for a different solution. Blame, if the relationship is ending, it cannot be because of their behavior. It must be because of your flaws. Your betrayal, your ingratitude, your supposed instability, and so the narrative begins to change. Suddenly, the same person who once claimed you were the most important person in their life may now describe you as impossible to please. Too sensitive, too demanding, too difficult. The admiration that once existed flips into criticism. The affection turns into distance. The respect becomes contempt. To someone witnessing this shift for the first time, it can feel shocking. It's as if the person you thought you knew has transformed overnight, but in reality, what you're seeing is not a new personality appearing. You're seeing the protective armor that was always there, finally stepping forward without disguise. Because the charm, the warmth, the apparent devotion, those qualities were often conditional. They flourished when the relationship served the narcissist's need for control and validation. But when that supply disappears, the emotional investment they showed can vanish with surprising speed. Now here's the important thing to understand. This cruelty is not a reflection of your worth. It is a reflection of their inability to process vulnerability. The anger you're seeing is not truly about you leaving. It's about what your leaving represents. It represents a loss of control, a loss of admiration, a loss of the emotional mirror that once reinforced their sense of identity. And when someone cannot tolerate those feelings internally, they project them outward. They may accuse you of being selfish. They may claim you've ruined everything. They may speak about you in ways that seem completely disconnected from the reality of your experience together. But psychologically, this projection serves a purpose. By casting you as the villain, they protect themselves from confronting the deeper shame that sits just beneath the surface. And this is why arguing with them during this phase rarely leads anywhere productive, because the conversation is no longer about understanding. It's about defending an identity. The more you attempt to explain your perspective, the more they twist the narrative. The more calmly you describe the patterns that hurt you, the more they reinterpret those patterns as evidence of your supposed faults. And if you're not careful, you can find yourself pulled back into the same exhausting cycle of explanation and defense that kept the relationship alive for so long. But something inside you has changed now. You're beginning to see the pattern clearly. You're beginning to understand that their sudden cruelty is not a revelation about you. It's a reaction to losing the influence they once had over your emotional world. And when you hold on to that understanding, something powerful happens. Their accusations begin to lose their weight. Their anger stops defining your sense of reality. You no longer feel the same urgent need to correct every distortion or defend every aspect of your character. Instead, you recognize what is unfolding as a psychological defense in motion, a defense that only activates when control is slipping away. And as painful as this phase can be, it often provides one final piece of clarity. Because the person who once seemed loving and supportive is now revealing the deeper structure of the dynamic, one that was always more about power than partnership. And when you see that clearly, something inside you settles. You stop searching for the version of them that once gave you hope. You stop trying to repair something that depends on your silence about the harm it caused. And most importantly, you stop mistaking their cruelty for truth. Because the moment the charm disappears and the blame begins is often the moment the mask finally falls. And once the mask has slipped and the shift from charm to cruelty has revealed itself, many people hope that this is where the story ends. They think, well, now the truth is visible. Now the distance will remain. Now we can simply move on with our lives. But with narcissistic dynamics, there is often one more move that appears when control has truly been lost. Because when they can no longer influence you directly, when your emotional reactions are no longer available to them, the narcissist often turns their attention somewhere else, toward the people around you. This is where the smear campaign begins. Now, to understand why this happens, we need to look at something very important about the psychology of narcissism. For someone who has built their identity around superiority, admiration, or control, public perception becomes extremely important. Their self-image is not only something they maintain internally, it is something they constantly reinforce through the way others see them. So, when a relationship ends, especially when the other person walks away calmly, it threatens that carefully constructed image. Because if people begin asking questions, if friends or family start wondering why the relationship ended, the narcissist fears something deeply uncomfortable. The possibility that their behavior might be exposed, and that possibility creates enormous psychological pressure. Rather than risk being seen as responsible for the breakdown of the relationship, they begin shaping the narrative before anyone else has the chance to. Stories start to circulate. You may hear that you were unstable, ungrateful, dramatic, impossible to please. You may hear that they tried everything to make the relationship work, but you refused to cooperate. Sometimes they portray themselves as the wounded party, the one who gave endlessly while you supposedly took advantage of their kindness. In other situations, the distortion becomes more subtle. They leave out key details. They emphasize moments that make them appear generous while ignoring the patterns that caused harm. They frame the entire story in a way that quietly shifts sympathy in their direction. And the most painful part of this process is that some people may believe them. Friends who only saw the charming side of the narcissist might struggle to reconcile the version of events you experienced with the version they are hearing. Mutual acquaintances may feel uncomfortable choosing sides, so they accept the narrative that seems simpler or less confrontational. For the person who has lived through the relationship, this can feel incredibly isolating. Because not only have you endured the emotional confusion within the relationship itself, now you may find yourself facing a second battle, the battle for your reputation. And many people fall into the trap of trying to fight that battle head on. They attempt to correct every rumor. They defend themselves in every conversation. They feel compelled to explain the full story to anyone who might have heard a distorted version. But here's something very important to understand about smear campaigns. They are designed to pull you back into the emotional arena. The narcissist may no longer have direct control over your reactions, but if they can provoke you into defending yourself publicly, they recreate the dynamic in a different form. Now the conflict continues in social spaces instead of private conversations. Now you are once again explaining, clarifying, proving your innocence. And from a psychological perspective, that keeps the focus exactly where the narcissist wants it, on the drama surrounding the relationship. This doesn't mean you should remain silent in situations where your integrity truly needs to be protected. There are moments when calm, clear truth is necessary, but there is a difference between standing in your truth and becoming trapped in endless attempts to control how every person perceives you. Because ultimately, the smear campaign says far more about the person spreading it than about the person targeted by it. Healthy individuals who know you well will notice the difference between someone who speaks with bitterness and someone who moves forward with quiet dignity. Over time, patterns reveal themselves. The narcissist may repeat the same narrative in future relationships. The same accusations may appear again, directed at someone new. The same dramatic stories may surface in different contexts. And gradually, the people who pay attention begin to see the consistency of that pattern, but in the early stages, it can still hurt deeply. Because human beings care about belonging, we care about how we are seen by the communities around us. Being misunderstood, misrepresented, or unfairly judged can stir powerful emotions. anger, sadness, even the urge to retaliate. And this is exactly the emotional territory where narcissistic dynamics thrive. So the most powerful response is not to match distortion with counterattack. The most powerful response is grounded clarity. You continue living your life with integrity. You allow your actions over time to speak louder than accusations. You trust that people who genuinely care about truth will eventually recognize it, not through dramatic arguments, but through the consistency of your character. Because the smear campaign is often the narcissist's final attempt to maintain control over the story. If they cannot control you, they will try to control how others see you. But what they cannot control, ultimately, is the quiet power of a life lived honestly. And as painful as it may feel in the moment, the truth has a remarkable quality. It does not need constant defense to survive. When you stop chasing every false narrative and simply stand in your integrity, something very important happens. The drama slowly loses its audience. The noise fades, and the version of you that no longer depends on their approval becomes stronger than any story they try to tell. Because in the end, protecting their image may be the narcissist's final move, but protecting your peace is your final freedom. Now, after the accusations, after the smear campaign, after the sudden shift in tone that leaves you wondering how someone who once claimed to care about you could speak about you in such a distorted way, something very important begins to settle inside you. At first, it doesn't feel like strength. It feels like exhaustion. You realize how much emotional energy the relationship demanded from you, how many conversations you replayed in your mind late at night, how many times you tried to find the right words that might finally make them understand your experience, how many moments you doubted your own perception of reality because the narrative kept shifting beneath your feet. And when you finally step away from that environment, your nervous system begins to notice the difference. The quiet feels unfamiliar at first, not because peace is uncomfortable in itself, but because your body has spent so long anticipating the next emotional disruption. When someone lives inside a cycle of manipulation, criticism, and unpredictability, the nervous system adapts. It becomes alert, watchful, always scanning for the next signal that conflict might be coming. So when you remove yourself from the dynamic, there's often a strange period where your body is still bracing for something that no longer arrives. But gradually, the stillness begins to feel real, and with that stillness comes clarity. You start seeing the relationship not through the lens of hope or confusion, but through the lens of understanding. You remember moments that once seemed isolated and begin recognizing them as part of a pattern. Conversations that once left you questioning yourself now make sense when viewed from a distance. And something important becomes undeniable. Your leaving did not simply end a relationship. It disrupted an illusion. You see, narcissistic dynamics rely heavily on a particular belief that their influence over you is permanent. That no matter how the relationship unfolds, no matter how many conflicts arise, you will remain emotionally tied to their approval, their criticism, their version of events. In other words, they believe they hold the psychological center of gravity. As long as you continue reacting to them, defending yourself to them, or seeking their validation, that belief stays intact. Even conflict keeps the connection alive. Even arguments maintain the emotional orbit. But the moment you step away calmly, without rage and without pleading, something fundamental changes. The gravitational center shifts. You are no longer organizing your emotional world around their behavior. And that shift breaks the illusion they depended on. Now, from their perspective, this can feel deeply threatening. Because if someone they once influenced so easily can walk away and rebuild their life without them, it challenges the narrative they've built about themselves. It suggests that their power was never as absolute as they believed, and that realization can be incredibly difficult for someone with strong narcissistic defenses to tolerate. But here's the part that often surprises people. Your decision to walk away doesn't just affect them. It transforms you, because for the first time in a long time, your emotional energy begins returning to where it belongs, back to you. You start noticing things that had been pushed aside during the relationship, your own interests, your own boundaries, your own sense of identity separate from the constant negotiations that once defined your interactions. You begin remembering what it feels like to make decisions without anticipating someone else's reaction. You begin rediscovering the parts of yourself that had quietly adapted in order to keep the peace. And perhaps most importantly, you begin trusting your perception again. That trust is incredibly powerful, because one of the most damaging effects of prolonged narcissistic dynamics is the erosion of self-trust. When someone repeatedly dismisses your feelings, rewrites events, or insists that your reactions are irrational, it gradually weakens your confidence in your own experience. You start asking yourself questions like, maybe I am too sensitive, maybe I misunderstood, maybe I'm expecting too much. But distance changes that. Distance allows your mind to reconnect with its natural clarity. The fog begins to lift. The contradictions that once confused you now appear obvious. And the emotional manipulation that once felt overwhelming becomes easier to recognize. This is the moment where the illusion truly breaks, not just for the narcissist, but for you as well. You see the relationship for what it was, not as a failure of love, but as a dynamic built on imbalance. And once that understanding settles in, something inside you becomes remarkably steady. The accusations lose their sting. The smear campaign loses its urgency. Even their anger begins to feel less personal and more predictable. Because you now understand that their reactions were never truly about your worth. They were about maintaining control. And when control disappears, the system reacts. But you are no longer inside that system, you're outside it. You're watching it from a place of awareness that didn't exist before. And in that space, something beautiful begins to grow. Self-respect, not the loud, defensive kind that tries to prove itself through arguments, but the quiet kind that simply knows its own value. You no longer feel the need to convince them of your truth. You no longer feel responsible for managing their emotions. You no longer measure your worth through their approval or criticism. Instead, you begin building a life that reflects your own values, one that isn't organized around avoiding conflict or earning validation. And when that happens, the illusion that once held the relationship together finally dissolves. Because the greatest threat to narcissistic control is not confrontation. It is independence, the moment you reclaim your emotional center and refuse to orbit around someone else's need for power. The entire illusion collapses. And when that illusion breaks, something very simple and very powerful remains. You are free. And after all of this, the confusion, the arguments, the attempts to pull you back, the anger, the distortions, even the attempts to damage your reputation, there comes a moment that is far quieter than people expect. It's not dramatic. It's not a triumphant speech where you finally say everything you wish you had said. It's not a moment where the narcissist suddenly understands your pain and offers the apology you once hoped for. In fact, most of the time, that moment arrives in complete silence. It's the moment you realize you no longer need them to understand. For a long time, your emotional energy may have been tied to the hope that if they could just see the truth, if they could finally recognize the harm they caused, then something inside you would feel complete. There's a natural human desire for resolution. We want our experiences to be acknowledged. We want fairness. We want the person who hurt us to understand the depth of what happened. But one of the most difficult truths in these dynamics is that closure rarely comes from the person who created the wound. Closure comes from clarity, and clarity begins to grow when you stop engaging in the struggle to make them see what they are unwilling or unable to see. Because every time you return to that argument, every time you try one more explanation, every time you defend yourself against another accusation, you step back into the emotional arena where the dynamic once thrived. You give the system new life, not intentionally, of course. You're simply trying to be understood. You're trying to restore truth to a situation that has been twisted again and again. But the result is that the connection continues to revolve around the same painful center. And so, the final step toward reclaiming your power is not louder confrontation. It's emotional detachment. Now, detachment is often misunderstood. Many people hear that word and imagine coldness or indifference. They imagine becoming someone who shuts down their feelings or refuses to care. But healthy detachment is not about becoming numb. It's about recognizing where your responsibility ends. You can care about someone and still refuse to participate in a dynamic that harms you. You can wish someone healing and still walk away from their behavior. You can acknowledge the pain that shaped them without sacrificing your own well-being to manage it. This is what emotional freedom begins to look like. You stop reacting to every message. You stop explaining yourself to people who have already decided not to listen. You stop chasing the illusion that one more conversation will finally resolve everything. Instead, your attention turns inward to your own healing, your own boundaries, your own life. And something remarkable happens when you make that shift. The emotional hooks that once pulled you back into the conflict begin to lose their grip. Their insults no longer define how you see yourself. Their attempts to provoke you no longer control your mood. Their version of the story no longer feels like something you must urgently correct. Not because the truth doesn't matter, but because you've realized that your peace matters more than winning an argument that was never fair to begin with. You see, when someone depends on manipulation to maintain power, they rely on your participation. They rely on your reactions. They rely on your willingness to stay emotionally entangled in the fight. But when you quietly step out of that pattern, the entire structure collapses. Imagine a stage where a play has been performed for years. The same script, the same arguments, the same emotional scenes repeated over and over again. The narcissist knows every line of that script. They know exactly which words trigger your frustration, your empathy, your desire to explain. But one day, the play begins and you don't step onto the stage. There's no argument, no emotional defense, no attempt to prove yourself, just silence, distance, and calm clarity. And without your participation, the performance cannot continue. That is the moment where the power truly shifts, not because you defeated them, but because you stopped playing a game that required you to lose in order for it to exist. From the outside, this kind of strength can look very ordinary. You simply go on with your life. You build healthier relationships. You surround yourself with people who respect your boundaries and value honest communication. But internally, something profound has happened. You have reclaimed your emotional autonomy. You have learned to trust your perception again. You have discovered that your worth does not depend on someone else's approval, attention, or interpretation of your character. And perhaps most importantly, you have broken a cycle that once felt impossible to escape, because narcissistic dynamics often survive not through force, but through emotional entanglement. Once that entanglement dissolves, the influence disappears with it, the accusations fade, the provocations lose their effect. The story they tell about you becomes just that, a story. Meanwhile, your life continues to expand in directions that were once blocked by constant emotional turbulence. You rediscover peace. You rediscover creativity. You rediscover the simple freedom of existing without needing to defend your reality. And when you reach that place, something becomes very clear. The most powerful response to manipulation was never revenge. It was release, because the moment you stop engaging with the chaos is the moment your life finally belongs to you again.